welcome to Edison Open House Global Healthcare 2022. Now, in this session, we're going to look at the work of Tryp Therapeutics, a company that's a leader in psychedelic drug development and which goes beyond the normal mental health indications. I'm really pleased to be joined by Chairman Greg Mckee. Greg, it's such a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Vivian. It's great to be here with you today.
Now, tell us a bit more for those that are uninitiated about Tryp Therapeutics.
Sure, happy to. So Tryp has been working in the psychedelic drug development space for a relatively short couple of years now. And as you mentioned in the opening, we're very focused on a couple of indications outside of the traditional mood disorders areas. And in particular, we're focused on treating patients with chronic pain and also eating disorders. So to begin with, we're looking at very different therapeutic indications. Secondly, we've got a very unique formulation and a unique route of administration that we're deploying with a novel compound that we're calling Tryp 803 that we think brings much better pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, which for the rest of us would mean better dosing and potentially better efficacy and better safety for patients. So we've got unique indications and a very unique molecule that we're developing in the psychedelic space that's all based around psilocybin, which is one of the most well-known chemistries in this arena.
Now you say psilocybin, we Brits say psilocybin, tomatoes. You can say both, yes, it's both okay.
That's right, both are just perfectly fine and correct. Yes, over here on this side of the pond, we say psilocybin, but as I understand there in the UK, it's pronounced psilocybin.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that you're focusing on areas of huge unmet need. Pain disorders, particularly when people are so anxious about opioids, is a huge market, but also eating disorders where we're seeing a growing problem.
That's true. We think that as a side benefit, we may have an opportunity to really make a dent in the opioid crisis that is just raging over here in the United States. We're very focused, by the way, on a specific type of pain called nociplastic pain, right? So this is pain that specifically is derived out of the central nervous system. It's pain that's sort of ongoing without any tissue damage or any damage to the nerves. The other two types of pain, which are known as nociceptive and neuropathic pain. So we're going after a very specific type of pain that we think likely warrants use of a psychedelic. Same with the eating disorders arena, which are very akin to anxiety and addictive type of behavior, we believe. So we think there's a strong link in utilizing a psychedelic drug. And we think that there's phenomenal unmet need, as you mentioned. There's literally millions of patients that are affected by these diseases. Overall, we think in our analysis, likely this is a $12 billion a year opportunity, literally impacting millions of patients around the world.
And just run over for us the difference between your version of psilocybin and psilocybin itself. What have you done to it that gives it a particular advantage?
So one of the big challenges in this area of drug development is that there's a lot of inconsistencies in terms of the experience that patients have. So the time it takes them to get into the psychedelic state, the amount of time that they spend in the psychedelic state, and other aspects of it. So for example, trying to exit that state if patients are having, quote, a bad trip, so to speak, is really challenging with an oral version of psilocybin. Literally, once you take that pill, you're along for the ride, so to speak, and there's really not much you can do about it at that point. So that's primarily driven by the fact that there's very inconsistent blood levels or very inconsistent exposure that the patient has with that type of chemistry. The way that the body metabolizes psilocybin, which is a prodrug to psilocin, or psilocin, I suppose is how it would be pronounced in the UK. Psilocybin is the prodrug and psilocin is the active ingredient that actually creates the psychedelic experience. The blood levels that patients have are known to be highly inconsistent. So what we're trying to do with our unique formulation and our route of administration is to use a psilocybin-based compound that we can deliver in a unique way and have much better control over the exposure that patients get to that chemistry, and hopefully create a much more consistent experience and one with potentially a better safety profile.
And what's the dosing schedule? Because one of the interesting things about this area is that it's not, as you would with a normal pill or other therapeutic, kind of daily or weekly administration.
That's correct. So psychedelic drug administration is going to be very unique, and how we commercialize this in the future is going to be quite different compared to traditional pharmaceutical drugs. So the dosing regimen is not precisely defined yet, although there's some consensus around the idea that there'll likely be one, maybe a couple of doses or so per year. And that dosing regimen includes psychotherapy, which involves pre-treating patients or having conversations with patients before they actually take the drug, which typically happens a few days, maybe a week in advance. And then there are typically 2 monitors or 2 psychotherapists with the patients at the time that they have their psychedelic experience. And then there are what are known as post-treatment integration sessions, again, psychotherapy sessions, post-treatment with those patients to create a much more durable experience. So you've got a therapeutic agent, which is unique in and of itself, then kind of coupled with psychotherapy, and the combination of the psychotherapy plus the drug, we believe, should have a durable effect for patients. And so that will create a quite a unique commercial strategy involving a number of different parts of that equation. It also includes treating patients in a unique setting where patients are comfortable, where they can be in the psychedelic state for many hours at a given time, and where they can be properly monitored. So the setting also is another element of this, which will be very different than having a prescription filled by your pharmacist and then taking a vial of pills home for, say, for daily use over, say, a 30-day period. So it would be very different than that type of traditional pharmaceutical dosing regimen.
So it's the safe space, it's the drug, and it's the psychotherapy, all 3 together.
That's right. It's all 3 of those components together, which creates a little bit of complexity, but we think that there's some really good examples that are close to this. So, for example, infusion centers, sleep centers, dialysis centers, and others, where patients go for episodic types of treatments, similar to what we think will be the regimen for psychedelic drug development and drug treatment. Now,
we've seen quite a lot in the press recently about the intellectual property rights of psilocybin, particularly from native communities. Where are you on the intellectual property for this?
The intellectual property will be really pretty interesting in this field because it will not revolve around composition of matter, which is the traditional approach that most pharmaceutical companies take, right? So typically, companies will find a very specific chemical entity, an NCE, or new chemical entity is typically what it's known as. They will create intellectual property around that specific, molecule, or potentially that target if it's a novel target. That will not be the case with psilocybin or psilocin, that is, both of which have been around for a very long time, along with, frankly, all the other chemistries in the psychedelic drug space, including MDMA, DMT, LSD, and others. These are all naturally derived compounds that have been around and known for quite a long time. So all the intellectual property will revolve around several different aspects. For us in particular, our IP estate will include IP around the dosage form, around the route of administration, around the formulation, and some other aspects of the drug. So, for example, we're looking at a couple of different biomarkers, and we believe those biomarkers may be indicative in terms of correlating use of a psychedelic and therapeutic outcomes. So our IP strategy will involve a number of different components, typically around formulation and around the route of administration primarily. We'll also have intellectual property rights, we believe, around the specific unique therapeutic indications, otherwise known as use patents, for these cases that have not been utilized in the past.
And do you think that the stigma about using these kind of products is receding now? Because in the past, there's been such a stigma associated with these psychedelic drugs that it's been difficult to get people to take them seriously. Do you think we're over that now?
It's an interesting question. I think the answer is generally yes, although it's evolving, right? This whole field has been around now for 40, almost 50 years, and it's gone through a number of different cycles, as you're sort of implying. And there, for certain, there has been stigma around this for a considerable period of time. Research has really rebounded pretty considerably now in the last 5 to 10 years or so, which I think is a really big step forward. And now, given the fact that there has been tremendous investment, as well as a lot of new companies that are working in this field, I do think that stigma is shifting pretty dramatically. I think that the primarily that's driven by the fact that a lot of these areas, including mood disorders, so PTSD, depression, and so forth, as well as the areas that we're looking at in chronic pain and eating disorders, really are therapeutic areas with not a lot of alternatives for the patients. So the physicians are at a bit of a loss in terms of what they can utilize to help these patients. And they're really looking for some novel, therapeutic interventions. Psychedelics could be that answer, we believe. And that, I think, in a large part is encouraging, companies, academic institutions, and physicians in general to begin to consider, utilizing this. I think that the biggest step forward for the field from here will revolve around clinical data and other developments in the industry. So as we continue to march down the traditional FDA approval process here in the United States, or the EMEA process there in Europe, I think that those data sets will become more compelling and will help alleviate whatever leftover stigma sort of is around in society.
So can you talk us through your different drug candidates that you've got in the pipeline and what investors can expect over the next year?
So we've got two different drug candidates in the pipeline. The first is we refer to as Tryp 8802. The second one is simply Tryp 8803. 8802 is utilizing an off-the-shelf oral psilocybin-based chemistry. We've decided to use that as a surrogate to answer a really basic question of whether or not there's activity or utility of this psychedelic agent in these unique areas of pain disorder, chronic pain and eating disorders. That is the first chemistry. The second chemistry, as I was describing a moment ago, we call Tryp 8803, and that is our novel formulation using this unique route of administration that we think will create a much more consistent experience for patients, as well as potentially create a better safety profile for those patients as well. So as we those are the two chemistries. And as we
so one is, if you like, the proof of concept, and the other one is this unique formulation, which will go forward.
Yes, that's a good way to characterize it. The first, for sure, is to answer this really fundamental question about whether or not there's activity. So a very simple yes or no type of question in terms of activity. And then, yes, the second compound, 8803, is what we will commercialize going forward. And that's our unique Tryp proprietary compound.
Okay, so now take us through what the timeline is over the next 12 months.
Right. So we've got quite an interesting year ahead of us. We recently had two different trials authorized by the Food and Drug Administration, so we can initiate both the study in binge eating disorder, our first trial in the eating disorders area, and also we've been authorized to initiate a study in fibromyalgia. So the next couple of steps on those two studies will be to dose first patients, which we anticipate happening in the next couple of quarters. Very likely we'll dose the patients in the binge eating disorder trial first in the first quarter of this year, and then fibromyalgia likely sometime in the second or third quarter of this year. We also have a third study in phantom limb pain, which we're collaborating with an academic institution here in California. We anticipate being able to disclose that partner and also near simultaneously be able to dose our first patient in that particular study also in the first quarter of this year. So those will be three big steps forward for us. And then, of course, following from that will be the interim or the early analysis of the initial sets of patients in those studies. Each one of those studies is smaller in size other than the phantom limb trial. They're approximately 10 to 20 patients each, and they're known as open label trials, which means we'll be able to discuss the patient data as it sort of comes along. And then the phantom limb trial, although it's 50 patients and it's blinded and controlled, it does have a 10 patient lead-in, and we'll have a readout from those first 10 patients, we think, relatively early sometime this year in 2022. So we're excited about those readouts for sure. So that's all on Tryp 8802, the proof of concept. And then on 8803, we are running some early, both preclinical and clinical experiments. We'll be in a position we anticipate in the next several months to be able to describe more specifically what that formulation is and what that route of administration is. And we'll also be in a position to make certain intellectual property filings related to that, as I had described earlier. So those are some big steps that will be happening over the next couple of quarters or so. And then there's some other things that we'll be working on, including potentially filing 2 more INDs this year, as well as making additional intellectual property filings and other types of announcements. So we're pretty excited about what this means. This year, 2022, will be highly focused on generating some of the early data, both around Tryp 8802, our proof of concept chemistry, as well as some early data on Tryp 8803, our novel proprietary compound. So exciting year ahead of us.
And hugely exciting, because phantom limb pain is such an enigma. This is where people have pain from a limb that's not actually there. And the only treatment, as I understand it at the moment, is actually something using mirrors or all sorts of strange things, but it's a desperate problem for people. And also fibromyalgia, a really, really misunderstood problem with a huge unmet need. So yeah, you haven't chosen the easy ones, Greg, if I may be so bold.
No, well, partially true. Yes, true, for sure. Although, very exciting, of course, to be working in these areas where there's high medical need. Fibromyalgia is pretty interesting. There's about 4 million or so patients that are inflicted with that indication, just here in the United States alone. And there are currently 3 approved drugs in that space. Unfortunately, they're not very efficacious. About 90% of patients drop off therapy in the first year, and there's a tremendous number of side effects with those. So they're not really effective overall in terms of treating patients in that field. So high unmet medical need, as you mentioned. Also, phantom limb pain, very interesting, but also a very good example of this nociplastic pain, as it's called, right? So this pain that's derived from a miswiring of the brain, right? So it literally, that pain signal comes from the central nervous system. And I think that's a really good example in terms of what we're trying to treat, right? And gives, I think, everyone a good idea in terms of the rationale of using a psychedelic. You're literally trying to use a psychedelic to rewire and change the way patients are relating to their pain. And we think that a psychedelic is a great approach, and that phantom limb is a prime example of where that can have effect. And you're correct. At the moment, the only treatment in that particular field right now is known as mirror box therapy, where essentially physicians and psychotherapists are trying to trick the patient's mind to believe that there's actually a limb where one does not exist, right? And patients still feel pain in that limb, which is very odd, of course. But we think that treatment is very fleeting. It's effective momentarily over short periods of time while the patient's being treated with mirror box therapy, but then that effect goes away once that stops. And we think that use of a psychedelic could potentially have a much more durable or long-lasting effect for patients with phantom limb pain. So yeah, very interesting areas, certainly challenging, as you said, but we think that's also a great place to add tremendous value to patients.
Well, there you have it, Tryp Therapeutics, absolutely fascinating area and such an unmet need in those particular areas you described, Greg. Thank you so much for being with us.
Happy to be here. Thanks so much for your time.